Ever wanted to draft for the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet DLC, the Indigo Disk, and don't know where to start? Well, this is a series for you. What's going on, everybody? You have Tone here, back with another episode of how to draft in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the Indigo Disk. And yes, it has been a little bit of time since I did do the last episode of this series, but do keep in mind that I do have IRL commitments to take into account, so I really found it difficult to actually sit down and put together something plausible for your viewing pleasure. But regardless, the series is going to be continuing as scheduled. Nonetheless, though, if you guys did miss the previous episode on the How to Draft series, the link will be in the description in the top right hand corner, so you can catch up on any previous episodes you missed, and there will also be a playlist in the description for any of the previous episodes. So the other reason why it took a little bit of time to actually make this video, aside from actually thinking of putting together a team, it was more so a sense of what exactly do I want to cover in terms of making your drafts as best as possible. And the only thing I didn't really felt like I covered in any way, shape, or form, and especially in terms of drafting, is basically a sense of quality versus quantity. And what do I mean by this? The definition of quality versus quantity does differ from person to person, depending on their draft tendencies, their draft playstyles, and so on and so forth. But basically, quality versus quantity is, do you value having more of a top-heavy team with high-quality Pokemon, and you're weaker towards the back end of your draft, or are you more of a quantity type person where you're splitting out your team, it's still relatively strong in the front, and you have good niche, not really niche, but you have good Gloomont in the back. This is more so seen from more of a draft tournament sort of standings, where quality versus quantity is really thrown out the window, because in a draft tournament standpoint, you're drafting only 8 Pokemon, and quality of your team is very, very important, even more so than a standard draft, considering that not only do you have less Pokemon to pick, you have to make the most of those 8 picks, considering that unlike a standard draft league format, you don't get any transactions, and you're pretty much forced with your team to prep for any situation that may come. And depending on how you draft or how your situation comes out, there will be situations where you're going to be matched up with people who have an overwhelming advantage over your team, to the point where you have to be super creative, not only with your drafting, but more importantly with your prep, because it is nigh on impossible to prep for any sort of situation that may come up, whether it be, especially in an 8-month format, especially if you're doing draft league tournaments. But this sort of aspect also applies to standard format, no matter the team. So in normal circumstances, when it comes to drafting, normally leagues will be drafting a minimum of 9 to 11 Pokemon. Some will do as many as 12. You have a restricted amount of points, whether it be, 110, 115, 120, whatever point values you may have. But the main thing to take into account here is making the most of not only your first picks, but also your back end picks. The Gloomons, they don't really come up that often in terms of a draft, but when it comes to actually trying to have a plan of attack or a plan of drafting, knowing what you want is sort of the first step, but it's not the most mandatory step, because there will never be a situation where you're planning a draft out and it's going to go as well as you actually plan it out. That sort of thinking doesn't really get you anywhere, and it's pretty much not really a delusional aspect. But when you have a plan A, you must have a plan B, a C, a D, going down the alphabet, because there's literally no way a plan will be as perfect as you make it, especially considering the fact that everybody else in your draft pool will probably have the exact same idea that you have, unless you're going an option as opposed to committing yourself to a specific playstyle, whether it be specifically like a weather aspect with getting like a Pelipper, Torkoal, or some sort of aspect of weather to go along with your draft to probably patch some holes. you do want to have a plan if you're not able to get said mon with that weather aspect. Which also brings up the flip side of the situation, not only getting good quality mons, but making sure that the number of mons you get is also pretty well in your wheelhouse. And by that I mean, you don't have to draft the minimum, let alone draft the maximum. The main thing to take into account when it comes to quality versus quantity is, do the Pokemon match your playstyle? 1. Do they fill any needed holes that you are lacking in your draft? 2. 3. Do you need to draft anything extra to make up for what you're lacking? There is no such thing as a perfect draft, and there's also no such thing as doubling up on typings. If the situation arises where you need to take another typing of a Pokemon you already had to fix a hole that you're lacking in, there is no harm in doing that. The aspect also comes up when it comes to terrestrialization and choosing Terra Captains. Most people will dislike the concept of Terra altogether because it makes prepping way more tedious than needs be. And it also brings joy to people in the sense that it makes stuff even more broken than it already is. Which mostly has been mitigated with most leagues committing to lower tier Terras, making more niche Pokemon these Terra Captains to make them shine more and make the hard hitters, the more prominent Pokemon in Draft League format, be a bit more in the background and make them prep for those low tier stuff. But in hindsight though, just making sure that what you have on your board or what you have planned is not going to really affect how you draft your team. And while that does seem convoluted in a sense, basically the main thing you take into account from what I'd say in this whole situation is there comes a line that you have to draw when it comes to drafting a team where it's nice to have those hard-hitting Pokemon, but there's no concept of drafting all those top-tier threats if you don't go in without a plan. And more importantly, it makes no sense to draft all those high-tier Pokemon if you're going to mean that you're lacking in an area. And basically what I mean by that is, while you may be hard-pressed to take a Pokemon just because of the fact that A, you don't want to face it as opposed to using it, you also don't want that Pokemon to mess with your plan. And that just comes with a bit of sacrifice. And by sacrifice, I mean you have to be able to push yourself into a situation where you're able to adjust and prep for every single situation that may come up in any given matchup. Yes, this sounds very, very difficult to actually grasp in the long term, especially for newer Draft League players. But the main thing to take away from this sort of segment that I want to talk about is, when it comes to drafting, making sure that what you have and what you need is two different things. So by that I mean what you currently have, what you have drafted or planned out, trying to make sure those holes around the team is filled is the most important thing to have. The other thing to take into account is making the points count and not trying to waste additional slots to try to make things more convoluted than it has to be. Sure, people can go the full route and take the maximum amount of Pokemon allowed in your draft league. Granted, this doesn't take into account like tournaments where you're stuck with your 8 and you're stuck with that team for the duration of your run. But from a normal standard draft league format, you really want to put yourself into a position where you're the most comfortable with what you have, regardless of any sort of future transactions your opponents might make to try to counteract your team to make their team better. You want to make sure that if you make any necessary changes to your team, you have to make sure that the quality around what you started with doesn't get worse than what you started with. So basically, what you take out, make sure whatever you put back in equally matches what you're giving up. So don't just drop something for the sake of dropping it without picking up something to alleviate what you're now lacking. The one thing you don't want to do is give your opponent any additional advantage over your team and make things more difficult for yourself when it comes to prep. And that is pretty much the main thing to take away from a sort of quality versus quantity. It may be nice to get those high-powered Pokemon, but it doesn't really matter getting those high-powered Pokemon if the overall quality of your team doesn't really mesh around what you're trying to accomplish. And on the flip side, while you may draft as many Pokemon as you're allowed to get, may be nice to have your opponent gives you more. It makes your opponent more It makes it more difficult for your opponent to prep against you. But if there's common weaknesses in that team in and of itself, that still makes you a liability for certain Pokemon potentially running through your entire team at any given notice. So trying to find a sort of balance between having good Pokemon that mesh together and having a good number of Pokemon that not messes with what you're already working with, it's sort of a main component balance to take into account when it comes to any sort of draft, no matter what format you're working with. Whether it be standard, whether it be low tier, even down to more stuff like Ubers and Little Cup, and more importantly even in a draft tournament setting where the margin of error for any sort of mistake is magnified even greater because of the fact that you're stuck with 8 Pokemon and you have to make the most of those 8 Pokemon. So your quality and the main thing you want to accomplish with that team of 8 has to be stretched out as thinly as you can to try to account for as many threats as possible with only 8 Pokemon. So while it may seem easy on paper to actually think of a team from a tournament setting to actually start out with, make your team go along the list, always make sure that having a backup plan is like the most important thing to have when it comes to any draft. Because like I said, the perfect draft doesn't exist, but at the same time, the perfect draft isn't always going to be available because you will get sniped. There is no way around that. Other people will have the same idea as you. Other people will value Pokemon more heavily than you will, and you have to be willing to adjust and make sacrifices as long as it means that you're not sacrificing the quality of your team by trying to make things more difficult for yourself in the long term. So yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to get at in terms of quality versus quantity on the whole of Draft League format. So it's really hard to like summate it into a specific one-liner for this sense, but if anything to take away from this sort of segment, it's basically getting the most value out of your team no matter what you pick. You're going to have to make sacrifices in order to make your team better, as long as it means that you're comfortable with what you have and you're not willing to sacrifice what you're lacking, which may seem confusing, but basically don't try to overcompensate for what you already have just for the sake of making your team better, quote unquote, in one aspect, but making it a whole lot worse in another aspect. You may be able to double up on certain typings, but if you're making yourself viably open to other typings that you're currently lacking in and you're relying solely on something like Terra to make up for it, that could come back to bite you, especially if you're not able to bring that specific Pokemon in that matchup. So it makes your life a whole lot more difficult when it comes to picking or team building in and of itself in that aspect. So so that's pretty much what I wanted to get through in terms of this particular segment of making the most of your picks without having to sacrifice without having to commit too many mons to your agenda, is basically what I'm getting at here. So with that all out of the way, moving on now to the actual agenda for this episode. And the agenda, or the core for this week, is going to be the combination of 3 Pokemon that I have not done before, but I've been wanting to use these 3 Pokemon in some sense for quite some time. And those 3 Pokemon are going to be, for this episode, Urshifu Rapid Strike, Iron Shreds, and Cinderace. So the name of the game for this episode is going to be Momentum. What do all these Pokemon have in common? Well, for starters, Urshifu Rapid Strike is already a hard-hitting, formidable Pokemon in and of itself. It's one of my favorite Pokemon from Generation 8. And it's just a good solid Pokemon all around. Good typing and water fighting. Surging Strikes is never a bad move to be clicking, especially considering it hits 3 times. It always crits. Gets momentum. Has close combat. Ice coverage with Ice Punch and Ice Spinner. U-turn for momentum. So on and so forth. Anything gets access to Sword Stance and Trailblazer boosted speed. Then you have a Pokemon like Iron Shreds, which is like a good, overall good utility mon, with rocks, with knockoff, rapid spin to remove hazards, full switch for momentum, and can even run special with stuff like Steel Beam, Earth Power. So yeah, it's not like a one-trick pony for Iron Shreds. And then Cinderace is one of those Pokemon that sort of fell off, especially with the nerfing of Libero, but regardless, it's still a fantastic Pokemon in general. Gives you additional hazard support with Court Change, momentum with U-turn, Pyro Ball is a good spammable move, priority with Sucker Punch, priority with Urshifu, as well as getting stuff like Sword Dance in and of itself, and a good coverage moves like Low Kick, High Jump Kick, Gunk Shot, and the like. So yeah, the name of the game for this week is going to be Momentum. So with that being said, just quickly run down the rules and roles for drafting. So nothing has changed from the last time. The only thing really to sort of omit in a sense would probably be the last part with the Fire, Water, Grass, and Dragon Steel Fairy Core. And the only reason why I say sort of omit, it's basically just because when it comes to drafting in some aspects, it's very difficult at times to find one of those Pokemon that doesn't really make your team worse in a sense. Like, it may seem mandatory here to actually go to the trouble of getting these Pokemon, but for example, grass types, if you don't have like an immediate strong one, you're going to be just like stuck getting like a low tier grass. And grass types are there, but it's more so having a grass that fits your team. That's probably what I find the most difficult in my estimation. Like, if you don't get like Ogerpon or Rillaboom or Meowscarada, I know I'm forgetting a few other grass type Pokemon, like something like even like Sinistra, the Cantera. Like, if you don't feel comfortable with something like that, it can be difficult to actually commit to something like that, like a low tier grass, especially if your team is like very, very weak to ground. On the flip side, with Dragon Steel Fairy Cores, there will be instances where you could potentially make a Dragon Steel Fairy Core, and at the same time, you don't necessarily need a dragon per se. Like, I've definitely made teams in the past where I've actually done fine without having a dragon on a team, or relying solely on using Terra for like lack of a fairy type if you're not comfortable drafting one of the low tier fairies. I know it's a few and far in between, but they're there. As for everything else, for the rules and roles, for the most part, again, we already have 2 strong priority options. We already have the Urshifu and the Cinderace with Aqua Jet and Sucker Punch / Quick Attack. It's not really strong, but it's there. At least 2 Stealth Rockers. We already have 1. We'll definitely pick up another one as the draft goes along. Spikes and Toxic Spikes are always great to have for additional chip damage. It is never a bad thing to force your opponent to prep for. At least 1 Hazard Remover. We have 2, so you don't have to worry about having to grab that initial hazard removal right away or stress out for the most part of getting that. 2 speed, 2 Pokemon with at least a base speed tier of 110 and higher. We already have 1 with Cinderace. Covering that won't be that difficult, especially considering we have something already close to it as it is with Iron Shreds at 106, I want to say, is the speed tier. 1 Wall Breaker. Urshifu Rapid Strike can definitely function as a wall breaker. Like, Choice Banded Surge Strikes are always very, very hard to deal with. Of course, the main knock on it is dealing with Rocky Helmet, but thankfully we do have knockoff support with Iron Shreds, so that's never a bad problem. 1 Ground Immunity. You never want to be in a situation where your team is easily dealt with by Earthquake in any way, shape, or form, so having a ground immunity is never a bad thing to have. And electric immunity, we already have on Iron Shreds. The last thing you also don't want to deal with is being Volt Switched on by your opponent in every given instance. So having a necessary ground type or something with Volt Absorb or any electric immunity is really, really good. One bulky water, we have Urshifu, which can technically function as a bulky water. It's definitely good on the physical defensive side, not so much on the special defensive side, but it's still bulky enough to be considered a bulky water, especially a water that has the ability to strike back hard. One grounded poison type Pokemon, you don't want to be overwhelmed by toxic spikes, so having a grounded poison is never a bad thing to have for any draft. One knockoff user, more is always better to have. We already have one with Shreds, so of course that's also very, very solid. One fast taunt or encore user, we have that already in Cinderace with access to taunt, but having another one is never a bad thing to have for any draft. So with that being said, let's move on to the team itself. So once again, for this draft, we'll be utilizing the UNPL draft pool for this episode. And we already have our 3 Pokemon in Urshifu, Rapid Strike, Iron Shreds, and Cinderace, rounds 1 through 3, when we are under the assumption that there will be no snipes. And we will have these 3 Pokemon at our disposal right away. So, we already have some roles accomplished with these first 3 picks. Only cost us 50 points. So we have 65 points to work with to figure out the rest of our draft. So, moving things along here, and keeping with the theme of momentum, we want to have some tanky Pokemon that can come in, tank hits, and pivot out if need be. Shreds already does that to some extent with its good typing, but it does lack in the recovery department. So to mitigate that, round 4, for the first time on the series, we're picking up Screamtail as our round 4 selection. So Screamtail provides us with another stealth rocker, a good defensive typing in Psychic and Fairy. It's not the most hard-hitting Pokemon, as it has very low offenses, but defensively, it tanks hits for days. It also provides a team with Witch support, it gives the team Stealth Rock, it gives the team Dual Scream support with Reflect and Light Screen, Encore support, good speed tier at base 111, and it gets Baton Pass, which is, for the most part, legal if you're only just dry passing. So, momentum is good. And it does have a plethora of other support options at its disposal. I already mentioned Encore. It has stuff like I think it has access to Thunder Wave as well, if I recall correctly. But yeah, Screamtail is just a very, very good bulky tank that fulfills a multitude of roles for this team. But the main thing to take away from this is just having an additional way of tanking hits for the team and having some extra momentum with Baton Pass, and also providing us with another Stealth Rocker as well as Wish support, Dual Screen support, so a potential SD Urshifu can be a bit easier for you to pull off in a late game scenario or as a mid game breaker, which can also set up for a win con if you like SD Trailblaze. So that is Screamtail for our round 4 selection. And moving on to round number 5, we do have Hisuian Zoroark. So I did also forget to mention of I left off the spin blocker port in the rules and roles, but of course if you want to bring a team with Hazard Stack, having a good ghost type Pokemon is always nice to mitigate the need for to deter rapid spin in general. And since this is more of a momentum / offensive approach, I figured having one of the best offensive spin blockers would be best to have for the team. And the best thing to have here would be a Hisuian Zoroark, which is also good in the sense of having illusion to mess with your opponent. If you have Hisuian Zoroark disguised as Screamtail, for example, they're both weak. Screamtail is weak to Ghost, Zoroark Hisuian is immune to Ghost. So having that mind game in the back is always good to have. Of course, the main caveat is Hisuian Zoroark is frail, but it does hit hard and it does have momentum with U-turn. So having an additional wall breaker / spin blocker for a more offensive approach is never a bad thing to have, especially on a team that's pretty much dedicated to trying to put itself in the best position with momentum and pivoting to put themselves in the best position to execute their own game plan. And for the most part, in terms of having a offensive spin blocker that also can mess with your opponent from a not a delusional standpoint, but from an offensive perspective, where it could not be Hisuian Zoroark disguised as something. Yeah, Hisuian Zoroark just felt like the best thing to have, especially for like a more offensive variant team that can still have the ability to have bulky pivots in the back with access to even more momentum. So Hisuian Zoroark felt good as a round 5 selection here, especially considering we already have good bulky pivots in Treads and Screamtail. Then moving on to our round 6 selection, we have our Spiker in Overquill. And the reason for Overquill, it gives us a Spiker as well as a grounded poison, as well as a dark type. 3 things that we were lacking. So while we did have a psychic immunity resists with Screamtail and Treads, and immunity is even better. For the most part, our dark type doesn't have knockoff, but again, we do have knockoff on Treads to get rid of any heavy duty boots, which makes the hazard stacking potential stick even more with Overquill. It also gets access to Intimidate to weaken those physical hits. Grounded Poison, as I mentioned, to get rid of Toxic Spikes. But yeah, having Spikes, Toxic Spikes can potentially pull off sets like SD, can be its own pseudo sweeper if you like SD Rain Dance with Swift Swim and stuff like Liquidation. But overall, Overquill is just a very solid Pokemon just to have the ability to hazard stack the opponent. It's a very good defensive Pokemon, and it does fit the mold of benefiting from stuff like Screamtail's Wish support for Overquill, since it lacks recovery outside of Pain Split. But having the ability to also switch in and resist Ghost is also not a bad thing to have, even though its special defenses are not the best in that regard, but the option is still there. So, moving on from that, for our round 7 choice, we do have Noivern. So Noivern gives the team another fast Pokemon, 123 space speed, the fastest Pokemon we have so far. It gives our team a Dragon and Flying type, so we have a ground immunity, and more importantly, it also gives the team some not only needed speed, but it also gives us an additional option if we want to run Defog. The odds of running Defog on Noivern is pretty much very slim, considering we already have a Spinner and Court Change, but the option again is still there. But it also benefits from stuff like having the hazard stack potential with Overquill, Screamtail, and Treads to drop Hurricanes and Draco Meteors, and on top of that, again, more momentum with U-Turn, and having access to Infiltrator to bypass any screens or substitutes to make it easier for your opponent to dissuade your opponent from trying to set up in Noivern's face. So, a pretty mid-tier pick here, but considering the option that we have, Noivern does fit the bill in what we are lacking so far. And again, we're keeping up a sort of momentum-based approach with this draft. So, moving on to round number 8, we do have some bit more momentum, this time though in the form of Vikavolt. So, the main reasoning for Vikavolt here is basically 2 things. 1, another ground immunity. But the other thing to take into account with this is the main thing to take away from this is just having the ability to force your opponent into thinking about having to deal with webs. And while the option of webs may not come up that much in terms of prep, putting at least the fear of bringing potential sticky webs in a game is never a bad thing to have. And on top of that, even without webs, Vikavolt is still a formidable special attacker. And one of the best things to have on any draft is slow pivoting, which is the other main thing that Vikavolt provides this team, because everything else on this team so far was relatively fast as is. The slowest Pokemon before Vikavolt was Overquill at 85 speed. So, having slow momentum is also great for any Pokemon, especially like a Hisuian Zoroark that benefits from slow momentum, to make it easier to get in And having a Pokemon like Vikavolt to tank hits is just is really nice for any draft for the most part. The only downside is to Vikavolt, while it may be immune to ground with Levitate, it's still sort of iffy, and because it's part bug type, you do have to bring heavy duty boots. But because you have Spin Treads, you have Core Chain Cinderace, the option of Defog Noivern, you can be a bit more expendable and not bring boots. You could bring something like Choice Specs if you really want to, or any other item for that matter, like Throat Spray, Bug Buzz with Agility. You can do that with a team like this as long as you have the potential for hazard removal, which this team has in spades. So yeah, the main thing for Vikavolt here is having a slow pivot with access to a strong Volt Switch or strong momentum move in general. So that is Vikavolt. Now, moving on to round number 9, we do have Brambleghast here, which may seem weird, but in what I was talking about earlier about quality versus quantity, if you need to double up on typings in order to cover for something in particular, don't be afraid to do so. This is one of those instances. This gives the team 2 ghost types, yes, so we have more inferences of deterring Rapid Spin. They both may be weak to knockoff, but we have 2 good dark resists already in Overquill and Urshifu. The other thing is, double ghost is not bad here, considering that one of the ghost types is immune to ghost in the Hisuian Zoroark. The other nice thing with Brambleghast, it gives us a actual ground resist without relying solely on Levitate, Vikavolt, and our Noivern. And it gives the team another Spiker, and look, another Rapid Spinner on top of that. Like, unnecessary roll compression that you'll just tank for any team for the most part. And then of course it gets access to priority with Shadow Sneak, can set up spikes itself, Strength Sap to keep itself healthy. So it's a very formidable Pokemon, just for the rules, the reasons I mentioned earlier. So we only have 5 points left here, and we're actually getting a full team of 11 here. So round 10, we do have Minior, and the reason for Minior is basically just something to come in and abuse what we currently have. There wasn't really much in the lower tier stuff that really screamed, what low tier mon can abuse what I currently have. With two stealth rockers, 2 spikers, webs, toxic spikes, and the option of reflect and light screen from Screamtail, you really want to have something to abuse all what you have on this team. The best choice is Minior, especially considering that in this instance, Minior can Terra. So having the ability to Shell Smash with Minior behind screens, and then potentially go for like Terra Flying Acrobatics at +2. Yeah, that's a bit of overkill, but the option is there, and I don't see a reason not to try to utilize something like that for any draft that I sure as hell would take Terra Minior in a heartbeat, especially for a team like this. And flying spam is never bad in any instance, because Minior has the tools to not only deal with flying types. It has flying stab with acrobatics, but it has also dual stab with rock coverage with Stone Edge, can do earthquake, a myriad of other stuff as well. So it's not just limited to one particular Shell Smash set. It can be physical, special, mixed. So yeah, that's the one thing I really like about Minior in the low tier. And then we only have 1 point left here, and this is more so of a support role. But for round 11, for 1 point, I figured why the hell not go out on a limb here and get our good friend and pretty much one of the more forgotten Pokemon, especially for 1 point, and that Pokemon is going to be Jumpluff for 1 point. So first off, why Jumpluff? What's the purpose? Well, there's actually a multitude of purposes here. As I mentioned, name of the game, momentum, which Jumpluff has. 1, 2, Infiltrator. 3, Jumpluff can technically set up itself with Sword Stance, even though its attack stat is very, very crap at 55. But it's still usable. 4. Good support pool with stuff like Stun Spore, if you're Sleep Powder, Strength Sap. But the other thing to take into account with Jumpluff not only is to have base 110 speed, Memento. Having Memento into something like a SD Urshifu, the potential SD Cinderace, Nasty Plot Hisuian Zoroark, Agility Vikavolt. The team on the surface doesn't really look like it's going to be threatening you right away. Like, it doesn't really scream, it doesn't really scream immediate wall breaker, but there are wall breakers on this team that can function, and there's also setup Pokemon on this team that can function in that role. Jumpluff gives you additional support to mitigate that. More specifically, since we now have Shell Slash Minior, why not give a Memento into Shell Slash Minior with our dual screens, with our Stealth Rock, with our spikes, with our Toxic Spikes, with the potential Sticky Web. It just made the most sense in terms of what we have already and what we can add to facilitate what we currently have on the board. So with that, that's the team. From a Terra aspect, Brambleghast, Minior, and Jumpluff can all Terrasilize, but the main one you're going to be caring about the most in this sense is Minior, and maybe Jumpluff. Maybe. But again, the option is there. But again, the one you care about the most here is Minior. So with that being said, we are now going to move on to alternatives for this draft. So first off, Screamtail. Honestly, it's hard to actually think of a Pokemon in general to replace Screamtail in and of itself because of what it provides for your team. If you want to keep the fairy type option and still try to mitigate having like at least a Stealth Rocker, there's the potential of adding like Tinkaton, but with Double Steel is kind of an iffy thing to do. There's also stuff like Hatterene if you want to at the very least keep the similar typing. Gardevoir as well, they both don't have Stealth Rock, but Hatterene also provides you with Magic Bounce, can be a standalone Trick Room sweeper, which a team doesn't really have. Like, Screamtail can set up Trick Room, but not really abuse it because it's so fast. But aside from that, though, those Pokemon do have the option of facilitating what Screamtail can do. Technically, also something like a Uxie would work too. They both have Psychic typing, but you're lacking in the Fairy department. So, there's options there. Then, Hisuian Zoroark, another option to consider. There's Gengar. Just for a similar offensive spin blocker. It gives you another grounded poison, can nasty plot. Ghost plus poison is still very, very good offensively speaking. But yeah, the main thing to take away from this was having an offensive ghost type. Of course, there's still stuff like Miss Magius if you want to go a little bit lower down the spectrum. And for the most part, the only thing that Gengar doesn't have is momentum in U-turn. If you don't care for that, then you can easily go the route of Gengar over Hisuian Zoroark. Then for Overquill, another option, if you want to save some points, there's a Hisuian Quillfish, similar typings. There's a Alolan Muck, again similar typings. It gives you a knockoff user, grounded poison, for an actual dark type itself, and another Pokemon that's sort of forgotten in time due to the power creep. Still good, but has definitely fallen off as the generation has gone on. Another option over Overquill, if you want to keep some sort of hazard aspect, especially if you're comfortable with keeping Brambleghast as your lone spiker, Hydreigon. It can definitely function as the replacement dark type. Again, doesn't have knockoff, but it gives you an offensive Stealth Rocker is the main thing. And if you get Gengar with Hisuian Zoroark, and you can easily get Hydreigon over Overquill if you just want to keep the typings the same. So then, after that, as opposed to Noivern, there is technically Cyclizar, but with the team already having Treads and Cinderace and Brambleghast in this instance as hazard removal, you can technically forego Cinderace for something else. Some other low tier dragon would probably be best, but the main thing for having Noivern on the team is the speed. That's the main thing to take into account here. Like 123 speed is very, very good for any draft, especially considering that you don't really have much else to work with in the speed department. But if you're really desperate, not really desperate, but as opposed to like Noivern, you could, like I said, you could go Cinderace. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not really a Pokemon that's necessary considering that you already have so much removal on this team as is. And there's nothing really else that you could actually fit in to like mitigate that sort of speed gap. Like there are some options. Like if you want like a setup dragon, there's something like a Haxorus. If you don't care for like having momentum, you can run Salamence. There's Flygon for something low tier. And there's even something like Como, but the thing with Como is having two fighting type Pokemon with the fairy resistance still treads. I basically just want to eliminate any sort of extra pressure to take off of treads, even though you also have Cinderace as well to act as a fairy check as well. But the main one taken to consider here would be Noivern, if only due to the fact that the team itself, as it is, there's no normal type on the team, so having a ghost immunity would definitely go a long way, especially considering the current ghost resist is Hisuian Zoroark and Overqwil. So having the added normal type Pokemon would help in the long run. Then for round 8, as opposed to Vikavolt, there's Electros, and there's also Bellibolt. But basically, all three of those Pokemon do have one thing in common. They're all slow pivots. And that's the main thing to take into account with the Vikavolt pick here. You don't need webs, but the option is there. Electros would also fit a lot better because it's a electric type Pokemon with Levitate. So having the extra ground resist your ground immunity is always nice. Again, but Bellibolt also fits the role too. It's not immune to ground, but in the UNPL tiering, you can Terra it. So if you don't feel comfortable in a situation where you're weak to ground, you can Terra the Bellibolt. It gives you some momentum with Volt Switch, has recovery with Slack Off, and can Toxic, the bulkier stuff. So yeah, it's still a formidable Pokemon, and I do love me some Bellibolt. Can't really go wrong with that in the long run. Then, round 9, as opposed to Bramblegast, there's technically not else to replace it with. Like technically you have like the Decidueye if you want Overqwil as your only form of spikes. So yeah, there's a Decidueye, there is some other low tier grass types, something like Appleton if you don't care for like just having a more sturdier ground resist. Like Bramblegast is sturdy, but it's not like bulky, but it's very, very usable in any sort of situation, and it's probably one of the more underrated grass type Pokemon that is available from a low tier, from a more not really niche perspective, but it's definitely usable from a low tier perspective. Even Sinistcha, if you can't Terra it, it's not bad either, just because of the fact that you can recover your HP with stuff like Machagacha. It can Calm Mind. Heat Proof is pretty good as an ability to at least mitigate the fire weakness. So yeah, you have options in terms of that. And if you want to go even further down not really further down the ladder, but something like Hisuian Electro could also work too if you don't really care for doubling up on electric types and you care about having additional speed. But it's not really going to do you much if you can't Terra it, so you're kind of stuck in the middle with some sort of iffy stuff with Hisuian Electro. Then Minior, not really much to replace Minior with, if only due to the fact that there's not really any other low tier Pokemon that's its point value but can still set up and sweep. The only other option that would come to mind as opposed to picking Minior is going to be Dreadnought. And while it may seem weird to double up on doing double water, it does work here. it has the same concepts here. It's not as fast, but it still has access to good coverage with rock and water, and then it has other options at its disposal too that makes it a good hard-hitting overall shell smash sweeper. And it's pretty formidable. It's forgetful, but not in a bad way. It's more forgetful in the fact of having bad, not really a bad typing, but like the moveset itself is pretty straightforward to the point where if you see a Dreadnought and it shell smashes, you already know what to expect. So, but other than that though, it does give you the access to another Stealth Rocker, which Minior does as well, so it keeps that sort of aspect. And it can also Sword Dance in a pinch and do like SD, Rain Dance with Swift Swim and stuff like that. And Strong Jaw with stuff like Ice Fang isn't bad either, or even Crunch for that matter. And then for the last mon, Jumpluff is sort of whatever, but the main thing with Jumpluff was just being a good utility Pokemon with access to Memento. From a 1-point perspective, the only other Pokemon I can think of that could potentially do the exact same thing, well, the only thing that's coming to mind is like 2 Pokemon in general. There is Mischievous, which having 3 ghost types is sort of overkill. But from a low tier, like 1 or 2 or even 3-point perspective, there's like Rapska, there's Spidops, and probably going along the like a slower tier, even something like, dare I say, not really. Man, what's the one I'm thinking of? There was one more in particular I was thinking of with Memento that's like semi-usable. It's gonna come back to me. I think it was Spiritomb, but I didn't really want to go 3 ghost types. But I think it was just Rapska and Spidops were the only ones I was thinking of, which is some weird options. But again, the main thing is with Jumpluff was just having the fast memento. There's also like I think it was Wugtrio. I really think it was Wugtrio I was thinking of that gets access to Memento. Like it's super odd because it's very, very forgetful, but it does function as a Memento user. But that's really grasping at straws there for the last mon. But the option's there, right? But yeah, in any case, that's going to be it for this episode of How to Draft. Hope you guys do enjoy the series regardless. And if you did, feel free to leave a like, drop a comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. This was a lot of fun to put together, and hopefully looking forward to actually spending more time to put more of these episodes together for you guys. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. Thank you guys again so much for watching, and until the next time guys, this is Tone, signing off for now. Peace out.